All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to talk about what I'd like to call threats to biodiversity. So, some things that we face on this planet that are threats to the overall biodiversity of organisms living on this planet. Um, I think it's important to point out, um, to take away from this lecture, the overall points that I'm going to put out, but also not to get too bogged down in the feelings of maybe despair that might come with this information. Um, the next lecture that we're going to talk about are the ways in which we have worked on conservation to sustain some of this biodiversity. So, the ways that we protect biodiversity. Um, it's important to know that scientists are learning new things every day in our fight against these threats. So, while a lot of this information is going to be sort of uh, despairing, or might put you in some sort of despair, um, I think it's important just to realize that we have the ability to fight these things if we take the correct action. Okay, but so let's get into it. So, the core threat to biodiversity on this planet and really to human welfare is actually the population. It's the combination of human population growth and the resources that are used by that population. You can see we are at 7.8 billion people. I encourage you to go look at the current world population calculator and just see how quickly that number is growing every second of the day. It's really kind of incredible to think about. Um, this number of people, every single one of these people is an individual just like you, and the human population requires resources to survive and grow, and those resources, like what we've learned before, are being removed unsustainably from the environment. Um, And we know that resources are not distributed evenly through this population. Okay, there are people that have a lot of resources. There are people that have very, very few resources, and that gradient is even wider than you might think when you look at not just the poorest person maybe in the United States, but the poorest person in a less developed country. Okay, so um, it's kind of unfathomable to think of the wealth inequality that we face in this world right now, if you consider those two things. So, if I wanted to talk about the four greatest proximate threats to biodiversity, they are habitat loss, overharvesting, the introduction of exotic species, and climate change. And so we'll go through all four of those today. The first two of these, which are uh, habitat loss and overharvesting, those are a direct result of human population growth and resource use. The third, which is introduction of exotic species, is due to the human population's ability for increased mobility and trade. And the fourth is sort of a combination of all of these things. The fourth major cause of extinction, which is anthropogenic or human caused climate change, it's predicted to become a significant impact this century, okay, maybe within the next 50 years. Some could argue that we're already seeing really significant impacts when you look at storms and wildfires and things like that. And just know that those things are only predicted to get worse within the next decade, within the next few decades. Global climate change is a consequence of the human population's need for energy, our use of fossil fuels to meet those needs. As you can see here, this is a graph that shows the amount of atmospheric carbon present in the atmosphere as far back as 450,000 years ago. If you take a look, you can see that depending on what was going on at that time, atmospheric carbon has always increased or decreased within a normal range. If you look within the last 10,000 years, um, you see what we're facing today is unprecedented levels of atmospheric carbon concentration. And just you can just see how concerning this is and how it's undeniable that this is an anthropogenic or man-made change. Um, so before we get into uh, climate change, let's get into the first threat to biodiversity, and that is habitat loss. So eliminating an organism's habitat, whether it's a forest, a coral reef, a grassland, a river, it's going to kill the individuals of that species. And if you remove the entire habitat that's within the range of a species, and unless they are one of the very, very, very few species that do well in human-built environments, this species is going to face extinction and eventually become extinct. Human destruction of habitats really accelerated in the later half of the 20th century, where we see things like industrial farming and really just the industrialization of the world in general. And so you see some really sort of disturbing images here where this is after some deforestation has occurred, and this guy really, he doesn't really know what to do, and he can't survive like this, right? That's not, there's no habitat here for him to survive. No vegetation for him to hide in, to live in, to eat, to hide from predators. And so this is just a really good example of what happens when we unsustainably take resources away from an environment. What you see are images that look like this, where you get habitat. This is called habitat fragmentation, where previously all of this land looked like this, and now the habitat has been fragmented down to a very small size. Some organisms do very well in habitat fragmentation. One of those that you're very familiar with are like deer, right? Deer do very well on the edges of their habitat, but other organisms, this is not going to be very good for them, needless to say. So um, here's an example of consider some really one of the most biodiverse places on the planet is the Sumatra. It's home to a species of orangutan, um, a species of elephant. This is Sumatran elephant, Sumatran orangutan, and the Sumatran tiger. And these are all critically endangered because half of Sumatra's forests is gone now. The neighboring island of Borneo, we talked about that when we talked about the tropical rainforests, is home to another species of orangutan, and it's also lost a similar area of forest where almost 50% of it is gone. Forest loss even continues in federally protected areas of Borneo, and if you ever look up some of the reasons why, you'll see that it's sort of a horribly just terribly disgusting ways in which humans are acting, especially when it's illegal. But we'll get into that. These are one example, the orangutan or the tiger. These are just examples of the critically endangered species that result from habitat loss. But really, if you think about it, they are the most visible of the species that are impacted, where thousands upon thousands of um, species are probably already gone, and we never really even knew that they were there in the first place. Because you have to remember that we discover species all the time that we never knew existed within rainforests just because of how dense they are. But when you take them all down, you might never have a chance to know that they were there in the first place. Um, so why are these forests being removed? And so one of them is for timber, okay, for getting wood for things that we use wood for. But a huge um, reason is palm oil, the palm oil industry. Um, Palm oil is used in many products, including food products, cosmetics, biodiesel. Um, Estimates were done of a 5-year global forest cover loss. This is 2000 to 2005. It was 3.1% of the global forest cover was decimated just for palm oil products. what happens is the trees, the plants that you see that are being planted here, they produce palm oil. Now, this is not normally what a rainforest looks like. You might find a few of these palm oil producing plants, but there will be tons of other species. And so what the palm oil industry does is they cut down all the forests and then plant only these trees, which is just not good for the biodiversity of not only the plants, but the animals that live within them and depend on them. Um, so this is just something to keep in mind. Look at the amount of products that most of us are very, very familiar with. A big one here is Nutella. Everyone loves Nutella for the most part, but it's a huge palm oil industry product. What I would suggest is if you don't want to support something like this, you can look into alternatives. There are always alternatives to products that are just as good. Certainly you'll see no judgment from me if you continue to buy these products. That's not what this class is about. But I'm just saying, if it's something that speaks to you in a way that you wanna try to do your part, there are always alternatives that do not use palm oil that you can get. Okay, let's keep going on. So, habitat destruction, it can affect ecosystems like forests, but it can affect all other ecosystems. And one of the main ones that we see here are the rivers and streams. Rivers and streams are important ecosystems, but they are frequently the target of habitat modification through building and from damming or water removal. When we create dams of rivers, it affects their flow regimes. Basically, it affects how rivers flow. And remember when I talked about how the removal of the wolves in Yellowstone caused these cascading effects, and one of them was the removal of the willow tree, or the willow tree and the aspen tree, which caused dams to not be built. Man-made dams affect wildlife just as much as animal-made dams. Altering the flow regime of a river can reduce or eliminate populations that are adapted to seasonal changes in flow. For example, an estimated 91% of river lengths in the United States have been modified with dams or bank modifications. And many fish species in the United States, especially rare species or species that have restricted distributions, or they only occur in a very small area, have seen declines caused by river damming and habitat loss. We've confirmed through research that species of amphibians that have to carry out parts of their life cycles in the aquatic and the terrestrial environments are at greater risk of population declines and extinction because of the likelihood that one of the habitats that they live in they'll lose access to it because of dams. And this is of particular concern because amphibians have been declining in numbers and basically going extinct more rapidly than any other groups. And there's a variety of reasons for that, which include novel diseases, but one of them is habitat loss due from dams. But just to make sure that we have some good news here, this is a map filled with the location of dams that have been removed just in the United States since the year 1912. What's interesting is that a lot of science has come out to say that dams don't really help all that much in terms of water preservation, and so a lot of dams have been taken out now that we've got science sort of supporting their removal. It does more good to remove them than it does to have them in place in a lot of areas. So the next one I want to talk about is overharvesting. Overharvesting is a serious threat to many species, but particularly to aquatic species. There are many examples of regulated fisheries, so government-regulated fisheries that were actually being monitored by scientists that nevertheless collapsed because of overharvesting. And you could see here just the sheer amount of individual fish that are being caught due to the really, really significant technology that humans have been able to develop to capture these fish. One example is the Western Atlantic cod fishery, and it's really the most spectacular recent fisheries collapse. You can see here, as recent as 1970, there were 4 million tons of this meat, this fish, which is the North Atlantic cod, and look at the rapid decline until 1993, and this has continued to shoot downwards because of the overcatch, or basically the overfishing. Um, Basically, what happens is uh, it you have a very hugely productive fishery for 400 years, but you get this introduction of the modern factory trawlers, or basically it's just technology that's really efficient at catching high numbers of these fish at one time. And what you do is you decimate the reproductive individuals, or the individuals that can produce the next generation. Once you do that, over a small amount of time, you see that there just aren't any new individuals being produced for the next generation. So basically, what happens is that the government basically shut down this fishery. Now, this is good to sort of hopefully bring back this population of fish, but that's a food stock that's no longer available for people, and it lays off a bunch of people too. And so, if things aren't done in a sustainable way, you see these wide cascading effects that affect not just the animals, but humans as well. Um, the causes of fishery collapse are both, like I said, economic and political. Most fisheries are managed as a common resource, means that they're available to anyone who's willing to fish. And that happens even when the fishing territory lies within a country's territorial waters. Um, when you have a resource that is common, which means that anybody who wants to fish can fish, it's subjected to this economic pressure known as the tragedy of the commons. And I'll just briefly get into this, but basically what it means is that if you have an area like the commons, it can be used by anyone. And if each owner really wants to maximize their benefit, there's really no reason that they shouldn't. There's no economic reason that everybody in this area shouldn't have 20 cows, because if you have 20 cows, you make more money. And as you have more cows, you make more money. However, if everyone has more cows, everyone has 20 plus cows, you get this depleted resource. You get the resource of the commons being past its tipping point. Um, so what happens here is that with an unregulated resource, this is logical since the benefit is enjoyed by the individual and the impacts are shared by all. And what happens is this leads to the ultimate overgrazing of the pasture. And so what happens in the fisheries example is the same thing as well. There's really no economic reason not to catch as many fish as possible, especially if there's no fines for catching too many fish. So what happens is every individual and every business catches as many fish as possible, and you get a depleted resource because of it. Thing I want to point out here is something that's kind of really near and dear to my heart is the island of Jamaica. And a lot of times you can't just think of it this overfishing as happening because of the result of maybe greedy corporations. Um, what you see in the island of Jamaica is that fishing has always been the way in which the people that live there have provided an economic sustainable resource for themselves, and also just fed themselves. And what happens is, as the population on Jamaica has increased past the point of sustainability, so has the fishing. So what happens is coral reefs depend on fish in order to keep them healthy. But once you overfish them, you get these cascading effects to where this is the same coral reef before and after overfishing has occurred, and you can see it's a lot less healthy here. And so, unfortunately, you can't tell, you can't morally tell some poor fisherman who's working in Jamaica that to stop fishing, to stop feeding their family. But what you see is that there's really there's no good option on the other side either. So allowing them to fish results in the basically um, the future going down the drain, in which they've fished to the point where there aren't any more fish to catch. And on the island of Jamaica, it's very rocky, and being able to farm on that island is very hard to do. And so there's just it's just this catch-22 where it's a double-edged sword, whatever phrase you want to use, where poor people need to eat, and the fact that overpopulation is occurring is forcing that to be harder and harder, and also having severe impacts on the environment. Okay, the next one I want to talk about, the next threat to biodiversity, is exotic species. Exotic species are species that have been intentionally or unintentionally introduced by us humans into an ecosystem in which they did not evolve. The reason this happens is because human transportation of people and goods, including intentional transport of organisms for trade, has dramatically increased the introduction of species into new ecosystems. These new introductions are sometimes at distances that are well beyond the capacity of that species to ever travel itself, and definitely outside the range of the species' natural predators. So we talked about this in our organismal interactions lecture. Sometimes these organisms get into environments where they have no natural predators, and they just boom, they explode, their populations explode, and they become top predators in this new environment, which brings a whole lot of pressures onto the ecosystem as a whole. But most exotic species introductions probably will fail because either there's a low number of individuals introduced, or they just adapt poorly to the ecosystem that they enter. However, some have characteristics that make them especially successful in a new ecosystem. Um, these exotic species often undergo dramatic population increases, and they reset ecological conditions in the new environment, which threaten the endemic, or the species that are supposed to live there. They just threaten their survivalhood. When that happens, they go from being called exotic species to invasive species. And we know that invasive species just threaten other species through competition for resources, or predation, or disease. And here's an interesting example of of an invasive species is our domesticated cats, and they are actually listed as invasive species. Cat predation on wildlife is the result of this organism's natural instincts and the behavior um, of what are called feral cats, basically cats that live wildly. Their natural instinct is to hunt small prey, and that includes birds, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, anything that they can get their paws on, literally. Some people actually will view this as a desirable phenomenon, such as the case of barn cats and cats kept for the intended purpose of pest control. However, really, contrary to popular belief, there is no scientific evidence that cats are an effective means of rodent control. Um, and ecologists actually oppose their use for this purpose because of the disproportionate harm they do to the beneficial native wildlife. Um, One interesting example is that as a invasive species and what they call as a super predator, which means it's a predator that has no other predator, they do considerable ecological damage. And here's an example. In Australia, hunting by cats helped drive at least 20 native mammals to extinction, and it continues to threaten at least 124 more. So cats alone have caused 20 native mammals in Australia to die. Now that's just one example where cats have hunted organisms to extinction. On other islands, cats have hunted almost every endemic reptile, including snakes and lizards and turtles, to extinction. And so they're super predators. They're cute, and we all love them to have them in the house, but they are really good predators, and they can reproduce really quickly, and nothing hunts them or keeps them in check. Feral and domestic cats kill billions of birds in the United States every year, And in the United States, songbird populations are declining year after year, and really one of the reasons is because of the cats. Here's one example. The introduction of cats has caused the extinction of at least 33 endemic species on islands throughout the world. So I don't, maybe you've never thought of cats as this really important invasive super predator. If you have a cat, I would just suggest, keeping them inside, or definitely getting them fixed so they can't reproduce unintentionally. Or if they do go outside, just keep an eye on them as best as possible. And if they're really attacking and killing birds every day, that's really not something that you should allow. But just something to think about. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so the last one I want to get into is climate change, and specifically the anthropogenic warming trend that's presently underway, and that means man-made again. Climate change is recognized as a major extinction threat, particularly when you combine it with the other threats such as habitat loss um, and just human population in general. Anthropogenic or man-made warming of the planet has been observed, and it's hypothesized to continue due to past and continuing emission of greenhouse gases. The primary one is carbon dioxide and also methane. Human introduction of those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is caused by burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. Um, Scientists agree that there's things that scientists do agree on and things that they don't agree on. The things that scientists don't agree on is how quickly is this going to be a problem? Is it going to be a problem in 50 years, 100 years, 150 years? What we know is it's going to be a problem in 50 years, but will it be 3% or 14% of organisms that are extinct, or will it be 50% of organisms that are extinct? So all scientists agree that it's going to be a problem. What scientists aren't really sure is how quickly is it going to be a major problem. Um, what we do agree on is that climate change will alter regional climates, including rainfall, snowfall, making habitats less hospitable to the species that live in them, and the warming trend will shift colder climates towards the north and south poles, which forces species that need those colder climates to move with their adapted climate norms, but also to face habitat gaps along the way. These shifting ranges will impose new competitive regimes on species as they find themselves in contact with other species that were not present in their historic range. Here's an example of that right here. This is a, whatever you want to call it, growler or grizzly bear, and it's what happens when a grizzly bear meets a polar bear. And this has been shown to happen in the wild. Here he is right here. It is a viable offspring that is produced from a grizzly and a polar bear. It is, I've always called it a growler bear. Apparently people call it a grizzly bear as well. Um, but this is sort of an interesting combination of what happens. But if you talk about these two species individually, they're both apex predators that would be top of the line that have never had to compete before, and they will compete in the future. Um, Changing climates also throw off the delicate timing adaptations that species have to seasonal food resources and breeding times. One example of that is birds that are migratory. Well, those migratory patterns happen because they know when food will be available at a specific time. With increasing temperatures, things are blooming and food is becoming more available earlier in the year. So let's say previously, I don't know, maybe birds arrive on April 15th. Well, if things start blooming 2 weeks before that, food will already have come and gone before the birds arrive. And then when the birds arrive to their normal breeding grounds, there won't be any food there to support them. That causes all of them to starve and populations to be decimated. Um, Climate gradients will also move up mountains, and eventually that'll crowd species higher in altitude and eliminate habitat for those species adapted to the highest elevation. And sometimes we'll see climates that will completely disappear. The rate of warming appears to be accelerated in the Arctic, which is recognized as a serious threat to polar bear populations that's going to require the sea ice to hunt seals. seals are the only source of protein available to polar bears. Um, what we see here is a trend of decreasing sea ice that has occurred since observations began in the mid 20th century. The rate of decline observed in recent years is far greater than previously predicted by climate models. And here we just see this big ice sheet that has been photographed in 1938 all the way to 2009. And you can see the effects of global climate warming happening here. Um, it's pretty shocking when you look at satellite images, even just from 10, 15 years ago to what we've got now. You can see some really, really extreme changes in the amount of ice. Finally, global warming is going to raise ocean levels due to what I just talked about, the melt water from glaciers. And basically, that's going to increase the volume occupied by warmer water. Shorelines are going to be inundated, which is going to reduce island size and maybe even have some islands disappear entirely. That's going to have an effect on species that live on islands, and humans live here. An extreme amount of individuals live on the coastlines of the United States and other places around the world. Um, this is going to be a huge, huge disaster for people that live on the coasts of the United States. And we see this every time that we get another storm, like a hurricane, where we see immense amounts of flooding, and this is going to only increase in the years to come. Additionally, the gradual melting and subsequent refreezing of the poles, glaciers, and higher elevation mountains, which is a cycle that has provided fresh water to environments for centuries, is going to be altered, and that could result in an overabundance of salt water and a shortage of fresh water. And so, with that, I think we've covered what we need to cover in terms of threats to biodiversity. So, once more, I just want to say that while these things are pretty devastating, we'll talk about ways in which we are fighting these in order just to brighten the mood a little bit. So, I will see you next time.